Good evening and welcome, everyone. It's a real honor to be here on the inaugural the opening day of the Raisina Dialogue. Very honored to be joined by such an esteemed panel for what I hope is a very, very interesting conversation. As we were prepping earlier, I said, we're going to treat this as a dinner party. We'll have a dinner party conversation up here for the first bit. And then I'll open it up. I'm hoping to open it up a little bit earlier to all of you as I look around the room. I know there's a lot of incredible experts here, and I want to bring in your thoughts and your questions and make this a real dialogue. So our dinner session is titled Concert of Oceans Towards a Digital Indo-Pacific. In this session, we're going to explore technological advances, increased digitalization, data protection, cybersecurity frameworks, and how these might be extended across the region for greater interconnectedness. We've seen a commitment to cooperate on digital public infrastructure, DPI, and cybersecurity in recent Quad and ASEAN statements, and a recognition that this will enhance the lives of citizens, create business opportunities, promote trade, strengthen supply chain resilience. And I think coupled with that, there's also an awareness that this requires robust data protection and cybersecurity, privacy, and it's also going to require increased trust at a time when trust is really starting to falter. So it's a big topic that we're being tasked to tackle. And so we've got just about 63 minutes. And as I said, we'll probably have about 20 minutes of that for Q&A. So let me just jump right into the first questions. I'm going to turn to Joint Secretary Amit Shukla first. India is one of the most successful examples of DPI. One of them is India's Unified Payment Interface, which is widely used in India and starting to be adopted and used around the world, including in the Indo-Pacific and Singapore, Malaysia, Nepal, Sri Lanka, perhaps some others I'm not aware of. As a leader in DPI, how has India balanced digital innovation with user privacy and cybersecurity?
Thank you, Sharon. Let me begin by stating that the classical thought of balancing innovation versus regulation and the associated aspects of security and cybersecurity, frankly speaking, India has made it outdated. And please allow me to explain this in a little bit. If I take you back, say around 10-15 years or so, when we were designing the modern digital payment systems or digital ID systems and those systems which today are known in India as the digital infrastructure, we had a couple of choices, and it was a very deliberate and conscious decision that this time we are not going to build specific products for specific problems or specific solutions. We decided to invest in platforms. And at that very moment, we also built into the platform certain features. So the platforms that we have built, for example, the Aadhaar platform or the UPI platforms, those are platforms which are flat, which are neutral, which are agnostic to multiple kinds of technologies. They have open APIs. And these things provided us, I would say, three big things, I would say. One is inclusion, because as you all know, the cost of, for example, doing a background check for opening a bank account reduced from few dollars to few cents. The time taken reduced from around 1.5 months to few hours. This has led to the situation which allowed us to open around 400 million Jan Dhan bank accounts. So this was I would say the achievement of inclusivity. Then I would say then the other important aspect of the platform was that it supported innovation. What we did was we provided a platform which was neutral for everybody. It provided a level playing field to the market, and multiple third-party providers have built on multiple solutions on top of those platforms. So those are the best examples of innovation thriving here. So our model not only supported it, but actually it catalyzed innovation. And the third thing is the most important one, which is covering half of your question, is the regulatory aspects. So we built the regulatory aspects inside the technical parameters of the platform itself. For example, the consent framework was built inside it. You all are aware of the account aggregator framework that we have today. The individual user gives consent for the data, what data to be used, for what purpose, and for what time duration also. Now, all this is controlled programmatically. So our approach has been to deal with these things in a, I would say, a technical method. We have created, I would say, a parallel wall of technology in addition to the legal requirements which are there. So our approach has been techno-legal solutions to these questions. So when you ask about cybersecurity or you ask about security of the data, all this was built by design by us several years ago in the architecture of the platform itself. We have used techno-legal solutions for this thing. And now it becomes all the more relevant today when we are realizing that we need to cooperate, we need to arrange for flow of data between countries, we need to cooperate so that the regulatory regimes between countries are interoperable. Now, this is the only way forward, where we need to build protocols which respect the sovereignty of individual states, so they can adapt to the individual states. So again, I would say the base layer would be a platform which is open, which has open APIs, and then the individual customization, innovative solutions by each country, each company, or individuals, or whatever it is, they adapt to the local requirements. So and we have shown this. All of you are aware, I'm sure you must be aware of the tremendous amount of digital investments that Government of India has done. We have around 1.4 billion Aadhaar card, the digital identity issued. The number of digital transactions, 2023 it was 120 billion. I don't have the data for 2024, but it has significantly changed the landscape in the country. The inclusion, the financial inclusivity, from 35% it has reached around 80%. The number of bank accounts is double the number of population. So basically there are multiple accounts, but in terms of the coverage, this is the achievement, I would say, which the technology has enabled. So coming back to your principal question, I think what we need to do is to agree to techno-legal solutions to address these kind of issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Lu Qingtong, Malaysia holds the ASEAN chairmanship this year and is pushing to finalize a digital economy framework agreement. Malaysia has made several digital advancements in the last year and is actually ranks the highest among ASEAN member states in cyber readiness. What do you see as the biggest benefit to successful integration within ASEAN, and how challenging is this going to be?
Thank you, Sharon. I'm glad to be back at Raisina. Last year, she hosted a session at 7:30 a.m. in this room. I'm glad that it's now we're doing 7:30 p.m. The cyber domain is not immune to the larger challenges in the Indo-Pacific, whether security or geopolitics or geoeconomics. The cyber domain will face a similar challenge. And I think that we have to keep it in mind. The second point I would like to make is that what Prime Minister Lucian mentioned, we are moving from efficiency to security in many of our work. But as far as ASEAN is concerned, I think we are still grappling with this whole questions of moving from efficiency to security, and very much trying to understand the new terms of reference. So most of the trade agreements, including DIFA, Digital Economy Framework Agreement, I think is still very much framed in creating better market access, creating more integration. We, at some point, will need to build in a lot more discussions on the security aspect, which I think we have not done enough, but we are going to do so. It's a difficult conversation because we're trying to move people away from just thinking about efficiency, thinking about market access, thinking about market integration, to also think about integrating the security feature into it. My third point is that ASEAN is not necessarily the regional architecture that you think about. See, it's not an EU, but it has a lot of potential. It has a lot of potential, and it is right in the middle of what we call Indo-Pacific. How to harness the ASEAN architecture, how to transform the ASEAN architecture in order for it to be fit for purpose and also fit for our era, our time. I think that is something that we will have to work together.
Yeah, absolutely. Sabine and I were actually talking just a second ago at the table about building in data privacy protections into FTAs. And, you know, I was reminded of the FTA and the strategic partnership agreement that the Japanese had negotiated with the EU. And at that time, they accepted GDPR. Right. So as we're looking and thinking about India and the EU and possible trade negotiations this year, are we going to see privacy, data protections, et cetera, being built into some of these negotiations going forward? Melissa, I'm going to come over to you. We saw in the Quad Leaders Summit in September of last year that they outlined a set of principles to guide the development and deployment of DPI. We now have a new administration in the United States. Quad, U.S. is you know, one of the key partners there. What do you predict? Do you think that this will continue as one of the priorities for the Quad? And not only that, but what's Australia's point of view here? And I will just add that Australia has been quite active in cybersecurity partnerships with ASEAN, and this is important to them. So how is this going to feed into, you know, the Quad going forward?
Well, it's a big question, so I will get there. I'll unpack it. But I first just wanted to respond to the speakers already. I mean, to Joint Secretary, when I look at what India has achieved with digital public infrastructure, I'm in awe. The scale, the way that it's helped, you know, digital and financial inclusion, it seems to me, you know, an enormous achievement. And I don't know if everyone in the room is aware of, you know, setting up a system that has the digital IDs, the payments, the locker, the connectivity, whole thing. So I completely understand why you want to share it with the world. Absolutely. And I've got to say, I love the optimism about that. I feel like as the only defence and security person on the panel, I'm probably going to come with that, you know, hard, cold reality of I'm not always sure we live in that optimistic a world. So, I mean, technology is frontline of geopolitics. We know that in the way that, you know, every part of technology chains have become contested. And I suppose when I'm hearing the utopia, but I'm worrying about the dystopia. So I'm worrying about it being less an ocean of connectivity and more lakes all cut off from each other, where countries are forced to choose which tech systems they're going to be in. And you'll get a situation where you have, for example, as Minister Tong said, you know, these are issues. You know, what if different members of ASEAN are on completely different technology ecosystems? What if members of the Pacific Islands Forum are? And at least for me, all the parts of the ecosystem are contested. You know, undersea cables, networks, payment systems, all part of them are geopolitically contested. So, I can see that we could use DPI as part of our offering to countries. Look, if you choose our tech ecosystem, you get this amazing suite. But I do worry because everything I hear from the region I live in over and over again is not wanting to be a battleground of geopolitical competition, wanting to have agency, wanting to be able to choose, and locking people in might be against that. So I'm genuinely interested in hearing from the panel on how to manage some of those issues. Now, Sharon, you asked specifically about the Quad, and I do have information on that. So I would see that, you know, the Quad was set up to do public goods, to say to countries that are thinking about where they align, to say, look, we have all of these wonderful things we invest. Please work with us. And DPI works perfectly with that. As you say, though, Sharon, the US is rather moving away from the idea of just providing public goods because that's the sort of world we want to live in. That said, I feel the Quad is pretty insulated in many ways. The President has, you know, a personal interest in it, feels it's one of his achievements. And, you know, technology competition, I think, is an area he can get behind. What the Quad's done since that meeting you discussed, since the September one last year, is there's been a Quad action plan on protecting undersea cables. Australia's got behind that. We now have a centre on undersea cables. The Quad investor network has put money into a strategic investment in cybersecurity. And there's been work in the Pacific on things like radio access network and telecommunications. The final thing you asked me to think about was what's Australia's role in all of this? And I'd say it's an enthusiastic supporter. Australia's probably not going to be at the forefront of innovation on all of these issues, and that's okay. You don't need us to be. We still have a functioning international development program at the moment, so that gives us something we can work with in the region. I asked and I was told I was allowed to be slightly cheeky. But, you know, broadly, all of our interests are aligning with this. My issue is the geopolitics one, not about the quality of what's being offered, but how do you manage the geopolitics?
Thank you. So you raised two good points, and I'm going to actually go to Minister Tong on the geopolitical question, because this impacts ASEAN very closely. You've always been sort of stuck in the middle of these two powers. And so how do you manage the geopolitics and the strategic thinking around building, you know, digital interconnectedness? And as Melissa pointed out, rather than an ocean, it turning into lakes, which would, you know, severely hamper trade and growth that we were aiming for.
I think we are most worried about bifurcation. We're most worried about bifurcation, and this is where I think the role of India, the role of Japan, the role of Korea, the role of EU are very important, because they are in the middle. They are not necessary. They're just like us. They're not necessarily wanting the world to bifurcate, and it's important for us to create as much standards as possible among us, among the middle, and hopefully the world doesn't have to bifurcate. And if the world bifurcates, it's not in the interest of EU, it's not in the interest of India, it's not in the interest of ASEAN.
Melissa, another point that you raised is that, you know, perhaps the United States or this administration would no longer be interested in digital public infrastructure, because I wonder if it's a messaging problem where it's sort of seen as a good for the masses, but there's no business element to it. But I don't know if that's necessarily correct. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure.
I think it's partly about how you present it, isn't it? That we're not talking about giving these things to other countries. We're talking about a battle for strategic influence in which our ability to provide some things transactionally assists.
No, thank you. 2 points. One, our model has shown that the way we are working, there is tremendous scope for innovation, and lots of companies are here in India working on the platforms that we have built, making money out of that by providing customized, tailor-made solutions and all. So it's not that it doesn't make business sense. And coming back to the other point about the security angle, so we have been actually repeatedly saying this thing. And the live example is there, what we call MOSIP. They have made the source code of the entire thing open, and MOSIP is the repository there. And from that source code repository, 13 different countries have taken up and implemented the digital ID system. So we are not saying to any country that you take it from us. We are saying that you take it from the open source repository. The fundamental principle is all that minister is saying or you are saying, all of us are saying the same thing. If we follow something, if we create standards, it will be useful for us, because otherwise it will lead to fragmentation. None of us wants fragmentation. We all want the fundamental use of this technology is connectivity. If we are, because of geopolitics or anything else, if we are leading this, if we are causing it to cause fragmentation, it's going against the fundamental utility of the technology. So that's the point. Thank you.
And Marcus, maybe I can come to you for a business perspective from Microsoft. How are you looking at the digitalization of a region as big as the Indo-Pacific as a business opportunity?
Yeah, look, I think there are clearly lots of opportunities in this region. I mean, if you think about the role that India has, this is not only a large market for tech companies, it's a massive source of innovation. For Microsoft as a company, we have products that are being developed in India. We have research labs that are doing work here, as well as doing the more traditional work we do commercially of partnering with local companies to help them use technologies to then innovate and serve local needs. And I think that's a model that you see generally across the region. So I think the opportunities are huge. I think to really achieve those opportunities in the face of some of the challenges we've talked about so far, we need to get some of the fundamentals working a little bit more seamlessly together. And I think there's probably three I'd point to. I think the first is in terms of policy frameworks. The important work, for example, that Malaysia has been doing in ASEAN on the DFRA is a great example of how to get some more of that interoperability and alignment between different laws, between different standards. We've talked about security a bit already on this panel. One area that we think is really ripe for further cooperation is more interoperability between cybersecurity regulations. If you look at something like the timelines that different cybersecurity laws require for notifying a cybersecurity breach, or the different thresholds that apply, they're all slightly different, not really different enough to make a material difference for a government getting in the information it needs. But that creates a lot of friction for businesses or for organisations that are trying to operate across the region in a more seamless way. And actually, it means that that data and information on cybersecurity threats is more fragmented across those countries. So when governments want to collaborate more with each other to get a better picture of the cyber threat environment, and they want companies to share the information, when you have that regulatory fragmentation, it actually pushes things in the other direction. So I think that those policy frameworks are key. The institutions are key, just having those habits of collaboration and engagement with industry. I think India is a great example of where the work that the government has been doing through the India AI mission has really focused on the role of public-private partnerships, not of just having government go it alone to develop more AI innovation capacity, but putting out PPPs for things like AI-based compute capabilities in India. It's a great example of taking that kind of PPP approach institutionally. And then finally, and maybe we'll get to this a bit more later, but I do think making sure there's access to the fundamental technologies that are needed. Governments using those technologies, regulators using those technologies. We've seen some great examples across this region of that innovation from governments themselves. And ultimately, you can't make the policy, you can't get the institutions right if you can't use the technology itself. So having those three things working together across the region are some of the things that I think are important to really achieve that potential.
I think that one of the important points here that we've touched on but haven't drawn out on is the question of trust. And for a company like Microsoft with a lot of users, and for a company that large that is looking to partner with governments, how do you win the trust of users and governments? And on the flip side, Microsoft is a big name, so what are you cautious about when you're partnering with governments who have different rules, different regulations, different standards, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two are related, right? I mean, I think when we think about what governments in particular want when they're looking at technology providers, not just to the governments themselves, but to the ecosystem within each country, they will want some certainty about the availability of infrastructure in that country. So one thing that has been a huge area of growth for us as a company across the region, but for others in the industry as well, is just building more of the data and AI infrastructure that's needed across the region. So investing in building data center capacity, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Malaysia, whether it's in India, that's a huge area of capturing a commercial opportunity for business. But those data centers aren't on wheels. That's a big, significant commitment to that country, and I think it's an important way of building trust in the market. I think if you kind of look up the tech stack from that infrastructure layer, if you go above to the applications that are being used in that market, of course, it's important that they're operated in line with the laws and regulations in that market. That's why we spend a lot of time working with governments to understand what are governments trying to achieve through regulation and policy. What are some of the learnings we might be able to share on ensuring that can be implemented effectively, that it's pragmatic. So I don't think there's one single thing to do to build trust. It's a sort of set of ingredients in that that go together in that recipe, but the investments in the infrastructure, the work at the applications layer, and then that effort to build the right regulatory and policy frameworks are all key.
Sabine, can I ask you, how does geopolitics factor into corporate strategy and private-public partnerships?
So thanks for the question. I think kind of touches on what everyone was saying, right? I think for companies, geopolitics is really seen as more about, do we have business continuity and resilience? Do I have enough clarity and understanding that when we're making investments, is this something that is going to change overnight or not? How do I think about the idea that we're putting in a lot of time, effort, and resources into sort of building a lot of that relationship, not just with the technology itself, but the ecosystem that the technology is actually sitting in. So, as our colleague from Microsoft was saying, everyone presumes that the internet infrastructure is always on. And yet, in some ways, we're still in a region where that's not a truism still. And yet, so much of that discussion is sort of sitting on top of that layer, sort of saying, well, businesses are always going to just care about whether or not the politics of the region or about whether or not it helps only business. That's not true. We really want to sort of see the fact of the matter is that in geopolitics, this fragmentation piece doesn't also help us get to the place where we all are interested, is to make this type of technology available and accessible. A lot of companies are interested in sort of seeing a longer term relationship with technologies for the long term, not just your immediate app or the immediate sort of application that you might be putting out into the market today, because that same application could turn into something else much later on. And so you really are interested in making sure that technology itself, the underpinnings of it, and the infrastructure that's involved in creating it, we care a lot about that. And so geopolitics, when they start to talk about fragmentation, that causes worry. And not just in the immediate company, but in the overall sense of whether consumers want to buy it, that trust element, whether or not investors are going to actually invest in the upcoming businesses that might be the next future companies that we'll see in 20 or 30 years, right? So it's not just one part of it, but that complexity becomes more of the conversation that our customers, that our investors and others ask, and the technology itself kind of gets sidelined because so many people are worried more about, hey, is that continuity going to be there? Is our investment actually going to pay off at the end? And I think that's something that not only do companies care about, frankly, countries care about too. So I think there is some level of where it becomes more of an existential conversation than I've ever seen before in the last 15 to 20 years, for sure. But I think overall, this isn't a conversation just about, if geopolitics isn't about fragmentation, it's also about continuity and thinking about, do we want to build for digital services as truly part of the economic landscape moving forward? Do we really believe in that? And are we going to protect that the way we've talked about other commodities, let's say, from the last 100 years or so? I still think sometimes we're sort of, as business and as governments, we talk about it as a luxury still, and yet each one of us has talked about how much it is at the core of what every government or every company is trying to do. So I still think that the discussion versus the practicality versus fragmentation pieces are still treating this as a luxury good, not truly a public good, as Amit Shukla and others have sort of really talked about in terms of DPI and others being part of not just, hey, it's public good, some people can have it. It actually is a business enabler. And then geopolitics and the complexity of it make that much difficult for us to then think about investments in the long term, both for trade and other purposes as well.
Do you think that we're dreaming to be talking about a digital ocean at this time? Is this a reality that can happen, or are we just so far away from it right now?
So I think there's it's funny. When I was young, there was a Bollywood song, actually. It was called Saat Samundar, and it talked about 7 oceans. And, I think about this as a tagline. The internet was created with this underpinning that it will always be available and that the ocean was a model. But yet when we really dig deep and we think about it, an ocean is lots of things. I mean, you think about the fact that it can get polluted. You think about the fact that people are using the resources of the ocean in a really terrible way. And you're thinking about the ocean as something that we all need to protect and to think about. And so I don't think it's a misinterpretation of it being the mental framework or the mental model. The thing is, are people doing it to actually protect it the way we're thinking about the ocean needing protection? Are we thinking about it in the sense that it is the right mental model versus lakes or rivers or tributaries? Because if we start to go down that road, what you're really thinking about then is everybody is going to have access to that in a way that is just not commensurate to the reality. Every part of the landscape now touches the internet. And I think the ocean is a really good analogy for looking at public commons. But I don't think it's enough of an analogy to get us to the place of really believing that each one of us has a responsibility to make sure that this good is going to be in working order, to then think about the aspirations for this region and for the businesses that want to be in this region. Without that, we're really sort of going to be, I think, in a very difficult place, and one in which security has to underline resilience. Just like when we talk about ocean resilience now, and we talk about the fact that a lot of places look at the ocean no more as just it's nice, it's beautiful, it's great to be on a beach, but we really want to protect it. It's the same with when we think about digital infrastructure. We really have to start changing the model around that.
Who do you think is going to be leading the charge on that? Is this companies in the era of the business deal? Is it going to be driven by business? Is it going to be maybe bilateral frameworks? Is it going to be country specific? We've talked a little bit about Quad and ASEAN. It seems to me that those might be a few steps behind. Who's leading the charge here?
So I think particularly in this region, I think it's actually going to be driven by multiple actors. I don't think that it's just about business only. Business can set up standards and governance, and I think that is one area that ASEAN and the Quad can play a much better constructive role with. I think, frankly, the Quad does have sort of the technological prowess in terms of being able to bring those countries together to talk about it. But at the same time, ASEAN has done a really good job when we talk about, sort of digital skilling and then being a really good forum for harmonization. But I do think that the private sector voice is kind of missing in all of this still. When we think about Quad and the cybersecurity dialogue, when we think about ASEAN and sort of track 1.5, there's some engagement, but I don't think it's systemic. And when we're talking about cybersecurity specifically, a lot of the sort of innovation and a lot of the threat intelligence comes from cybersecurity companies, not from governments themselves. So we really need to really build that arm of public-private partnership to be sharing that and to make that sort of consistent. And then frankly, I would say that, in terms of the region itself, there's so much promise around sort of building digital infrastructure to get people online, to be able to get small and medium businesses online. And frankly, small, medium businesses are the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to that. I think a lot of people talk about their risk landscapes and whether or not, they have specific data centers and AI security and all that. But when you look at the region, not every company is going to be sort of right away entering the world of AI. We still have a lot of companies that are just online for e-commerce purposes. That'll be their first interaction. Payment systems, thinking about sort of how do you take that transition from being a company that is going to be using, ultimately AI is the wrapper maybe, But before we get there, let's talk about just, again, making that infrastructure really digitally sound, secure, so that whatever you use on top of it, whether it's AI or others, is a different thing. But AI security, I think, actually needs a seat at the table. We've talked a lot about AI competition, but frankly, AI security is a part and parcel of that. And without it, it doesn't matter what competition you're doing. People are still going to be using AI for nefarious purposes and also for good purposes. So I think we really need to come to terms with discussing that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up AI, because AI is also changing the cybersecurity landscape. Marcus or Sabine, if you can just give us a sort of brief explanation of how this is being used and how it's really altering cybersecurity at this time.
Look, I do think AI is a critical cybersecurity topic. And I think, just to be open, we obviously get a lot of questions from governments that are interested in whether AI, or the extent to which AI improves offensive cyber capabilities. And that's the right question to ask. I think we've seen examples of how it does. AI is streamlining all sorts of processes in legitimate operations of organizations, but unfortunately in illegitimate operations of organizations as well, including if you're a cyber criminal network or even a nation state actor. So I think, there's rightfully some concern there. I do think that ultimately I'm optimistic that it's actually going to be more useful for cyber defense, not just in the long run, but actually kind of now. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but it does rest on governments playing a key role together with industry. I do think that the key reason is we know that the most important input for AI to be effective is data. And we do have a huge amount of threat intelligence data, as Sabine mentioned, that's gathered from devices, from networks, from endpoints that all of us are using all the time. I mean, for Microsoft alone, each day there are 78 trillion signals that are collected across all of those devices and endpoints globally. That's a huge amount of data that is then an input for AI systems to help identify cyber threats, to mitigate cyber attacks even before a human is aware. What we need to do more of in this region, but globally, is have the right frameworks in place so more of that data can be pooled, particularly among like-minded countries who want to work together to address some of those cyber threats. If you can make that pool of data larger and larger, the AI gets more and more effective. And so I think it really starts to tip the scales in favour of cyber defence. So I think it's absolutely a key issue, both on the offensive side, but really if we can get the right frameworks in place, if we can leverage that data effectively, it can really tip the scales in favour of cyber defence.
I would say that honestly, it's probably about talking about what they call the cyber advantage in terms of both for defenders and then for people who are, using it for offensive capabilities. But I think the question is really about what do we have today in terms of that threat intelligence and making that available to people to be able to be ready for the risk that they may see, both at a country level, but also then looking at businesses that are operating in the region. And I think right now there's a lack of public-private partnerships to be able to really take advantage of sort of large data sets that are then crunched by, AI systems that we've talked about a little bit in terms of thinking about then where does that cyber advantage then lie? Is it with the then folks who have the threat intelligence, or is it the cyber criminals and others that people are worried about and the defenders are going to be in somewhat of a back foot? I don't think we're at a definitive place yet, but I don't think we've even really truly done the work of making all of that intelligence available to be able to then make sure that defenders are always one leg up or have one leg up before we think about sort of the cyber offensive capabilities and other things. I think there is something to be said about really doing that really well. And in this region in particular, I think that sort of threat intelligence sharing partnerships, public-private partnerships with the private sector can go such a long way to making sure that if something is to happen, and that's the thing, people have to build these frames with resiliency in mind. There's never going to be a zero-sum situation where it's either we've fully gotten 100% one way or the other. There's always going to be something new at the frontier, but sort of more of that collective resilience, public-private partnerships to be able to make sure that we get that intelligence sharing when we can. And then at the same time, as Marcus kind of touched upon, harmonization of those standards in particular. Incident reporting, why do we have all these different requirements when fundamentally if we can get that in a place where people can get the information that they need faster, quicker, so that they can respond with the best intelligence and with the best capabilities they have, will be a long way to making sure that cybersecurity is in the best place that it needs to be for the region and frankly globally.
I think this has been really fascinating. We've put a lot of ideas out here on the table. I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. So I'm going to take a few, and then we'll throw it back to the panel, and hopefully we can do a couple of rounds. I saw Steve's hand go up, so just going to call on my friend Steve first.
Hey, excellent panel. Steve Clemens with National Interest. So, I don't think any of you were kumbaya, but you were close. In the sense that I heard about like-minded nations, about if we could get big data sets together. I mean, we're not working in a world right now where data from different nations is easily flowing together. It's going the other direction. We're seeing balkanization. We're seeing extraordinary stress, in part from my own country, the United States. So how much of the world that you're talking about is possible if the United States becomes a hyper-nationalist and essentially says, we don't give a crap about cooperating on these issues because we actually don't really fundamentally believe that being internationally engaged enhances U.S. domestic security. I think that's the vibe from the White House right now, and I just want to be very honest that I think that's not what I'm hearing from your panel.
Hi, I was actually, I don't need to stand up, I'm 6'2". I was told to move by the camera earlier for I'm Erin Saltman. I'm with the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, of which Microsoft and many other tech companies are members. And one thing that we often see when tech companies come to us asking about, we're just looking at terrorism and violent extremism, just one small topic among many harms topics. And actually complying with legislation and legislative frameworks is already very difficult for some of the largest tech companies. I know there's not a lot of tech empathy, usually, naturally, but for smaller and medium companies in particular, it does seem like there's not a lot of cooperation. There's not a UN of online legislation. And when we reviewed something like 30 countries, we found that sometimes it's very much clashing. So one post might be absolutely preserved and not allowed to be taken down in one country and absolutely mandatory to remove in another. And especially with AI, we see nearly 20 different countries or regions that have put out both voluntary and involuntary frameworks on how to do trust and safety with AI. And we usually see three pillars that conflict: privacy, security, and voice or free speech. And of course, we all want to solve for all three, but if you solve for one over the others, it's usually at the cost of the other two. So when you guys are looking at regional divergences and collaborations, maybe to go towards a positive, where do you see common ground where people are trying to work together to solve for some of these legislative frameworks? And then where do you find the largest sticking points right now?
I'm not going to get up either. I'm quite stuffed. But my name is Bharat Ramanan, and I lead geopolitics at DP World. And as you were speaking about the geopolitical question, I couldn't help but thinking about 1823, which was about the Monroe Doctrine, which was essentially the U.S. speaking in terms of the fact that they didn't want the Europeans interfering in their neighborhood. This was in the times of colonization, of course. And that sort of has played its role over the years, where we've seen maybe this idea of don't operate in our hemisphere gaining traction. But now I think you're seeing that play out in the tech space, where you have these two emerging rival hemispheric leaders, if you like, China and the US. And that kind of gets me thinking about where India lies in that entire spectrum. So maybe you might want to address that. But more importantly, when you have that kind of sort of bipolarity leading, where does industry really play a role in this? Are you just guys going to be sort of receivers? Are you able to shape anything here? Where does the opportunity lie and the risk? Thanks.
Let me turn back to the panel. And feel free to grab whatever question interested you or whichever one was directed at you. Melissa, go ahead.
I was going to respond to Steve because, yes, you can tell I'm an Australian by the accent, but you can actually tell, really, by the look of shell-shocked horror, because all of the pillars of the way that Australia interacted with the world are currently falling apart. The US is no longer the US we are used to. Global free trade is in a terrible state, and global rules and multilateralism are falling apart. So I'd expected to be coming here and being nothing but negative, and I've actually found it quite cheering to think that there might be some things that are still possible in this terrible wreck that we are currently in. But look, I think it's a fair question. On some things, I think the US is just dealing itself out of what's happening globally. So I'd put that in terms of climate change. Everyone else is just going to have to get on with it. But out of all of the things that I think the US will jettison, I think the Quad has a decent prospect of keeping going. And I think anything that can be seen as part of US winning technology and business wars will also be able to be maintained. So I think what we're talking about is the more likely for the US to still be part of.
Yeah, Minister Tong or Amit Shukla, do either of you have a response to this question about the U.S. pulling back at this time?
Partly to that, I would say. So when you said, the point of hyper-nationalization and what if one country doesn't agree to the mechanisms of data flow and all. So we have all along been saying that the mechanism that we are talking about is basically going to be the mechanism to which ultimately everybody will agree, particularly for data flow. Today, for example, there are various AI models developed by various companies. What they've done is that they've scraped the internet. Whatever is available, they have trained their models for. The next step would be that they would require more specific data, which is not in the public domain. So they will have to come to specific countries for specific requirements. And your requirement might be for a specific purpose. My requirement is for a specific purpose. India has always been looking towards developmental aspects. We are, as you are aware, we have already launched our India AI mission. We are trying to make our own solutions. We are trying to use AI for improving the productivity of agriculture or improving the access to health and those kind of things. And we, of course, because of being highly digitized, we, of course, are sitting on a very massive amount of data, which is not on the public domain also. Lots of data with the hospitals or the travel companies and those kind of things. Now, when you start looking at, when you arrive at that stage, when you have done everything with the data available in the internet and you need the data which is specific, which are available in a specific sector of a company or a country, you are going to see the situations where you need to see free flow of data or whatever kind of flow of data across borders. It's the solution for that stage that we are talking about. We are talking about a mechanism, the concept of DPI. We are now talking about DPI for the training of AI models also. Our DEPA is the empowerment and protection architecture. It is planning to provide the privacy and protection of individuals' data by design itself. We have already launched a couple of pilot projects. You will be seeing those in the coming years. When we share the data for training of the AI model, individuals' privacy is fully protected. In fact, the data itself is used once only. Second time you have to train it again, you have to come back to the consent seeker again. So we are already designing solutions for those kind of situations, which is probably a little ahead, maybe 6 months or 1 year ahead in future. That's point one. On second point, somebody mentioned here, you mentioned about bipolarity between US and China. Where does India, see itself and all? If you go back 10 years, 12 years or 15 years or so, and see the same thing was there was kind of a situation between, two big countries. What did India do? I again say, we do what we need. Our priorities are development oriented. We were not weaponizing the digital technology. We were using it for inclusivity, for access to the people, to the financial system, for education, for health. It's entirely development oriented. And the solutions that we created were unique to India. At population scale, 1/6 of humanity has this kind of digital ID that we have prepared. Around 900 million people are using the payment system that we have devised. Our focus is to solve our problems. And it just happens that many of our problems are faced by many of our fellow countries also. We are happy to share our experiences and we would be happy to learn from others' experiences. But the approach, the coming back to a fundamental question, the approach for us is not choosing between A and B. The approach is what do we need to do in our own developmental march. And our approach is guided by that. Thank you.
To answer the question of US, and also you mentioned about 1823, our thinking about the current global order is very much thinking of basically referring back to the 1945 order. But in the 1945 order, there was one very important episode, which was the Bandung meeting or Bandung Summit in 1955. The Bandung Summit basically was a gathering of new nations, and the new nations came together and say that we are non-aligned and we do not want to be choosing between the superpowers, between USSR and the United States. I think there is always a third realm. Of course, India's foreign policy is a classic example. Even during the height of the Ukraine war, India is still buying oil from Russia. It is basically a clear indication that there are many actors around the world that has agencies that doesn't want to choose between the big giants and wanted to create the third realm. And I think recent development shows that even EU will have to basically take that role. So that it is important for India, for ASEAN, for Japan, for Korea, for all these countries which has some technological capability to come together to say, okay, let's build something. And what do we have to build? I think first of all, we have to recognize that the digital realm is a public good. And it is a public good that has to be paid for. The question is how to pay for it within your own country and also externally and globally, or at least regionally. And how to set up rules and standards. Rules and standards will help to harmonize and to create some form of rules of the games or rules of the sea or rules of the road, so that at least we don't get into too much of conflict. And finally, we will have to ask ourselves whether we have capability to enforce the rules, whether we have capability to enforce rules, both offensive and defensive, at a national level and also at a regional level or broader level. Those are difficult questions. We are, say for example, Malaysia, as far as the banking sector, we clear those rules. We know who pay for what, and we know that it's a public goods. We know that there are rules. We know that there are people who can enforce it. But beyond the banking sector, all other sectors we're developing. We're not as advanced stage as India, but it is something that we will have to do together. And they are already template, but we need a lot more political will and cooperation.
Maybe just quickly, I think we've covered a lot of the geopolitical stuff. I think the important question that you raised about sort of balancing some of these objectives off, I think is actually really relevant to that geopolitical question as well. Look, we've got to accept the reality that as technology has become more fundamental to the functioning of our economies, our societies and our governments, it is being viewed through an economic security lens, a national security lens, as well as the more traditional way we might have viewed it in terms of the maybe economic or societal uses. That's sort of the reality that we're in today. But I think, getting to your question, you talked about, say, the trade-offs when technology policies are being designed between, say, privacy and safety. And I think that in some ways there are just additional concerns being thrown into that mix as well. There are more considerations about national security. There are more considerations about sovereignty for countries. I guess maybe I'm optimistic that it's possible to reconcile those objectives in the vast majority of cases. I think it just becomes more difficult. I think that industry needs to be part of those conversations. We haven't really talked about the role of civil society much, but I think civil society is an essential actor in all of the topics that we've been talking about. The research community, academia. We just need more points of view. We need more sort of deliberation. We need more experimentation to arrive at the right policy mix as we try to, trade off the different considerations that you talked about.
Let me open it up for another round of questions. Yes, sir. Thank you for your patience.
All right, thanks. I'm not 6 feet tall, so I'll stand up. Brent Sadler from the Heritage Foundation. I may have missed it, but one word that I know in this topic that comes up is attribution, being able to determine the source of an attack, if it's state-backed or if it's criminal, sometimes both. And since the theme of this has got oceans as an old Navy hand, we had to deal with pirates back in the past. And some of those pirates were also state-sponsored. Has the attribution gotten to a level where there's confidence, and maybe it's just small groups, but can you give an example of where it's been effective to discern what is a state-sponsored, what is a criminal entity, and effective action taken? And maybe trying to pick up on the theme earlier, as Sabine, on a government and private cooperation, especially in this idea as more players enter into the field, so to speak.
We've got time for a couple more. Yes, sir, over there.
Thanks so much. With all the reference to, say, minilateralism and the breakdown of particularly UN structures, can you speak about the relevance of institutions such as ITU, which has served a technical function precisely in the backbone for the types of technologies you're describing, WIPO, and other specialized institutions that have provided that broader global infrastructure in light of the changes you're describing, and if there is a relevance for them or aspects of what they've advanced in light of the futures you are presenting. Thank you. Apologies. Itonde Kikoma, President and CEO of Interpeace in Geneva.
Thank you. I can take one more if there's one more from the audience. Oh, yes.
Thank you very much for the exciting discussion so far. Avelina Chakarova is my name, and since you dropped the buzzword bifurcation, and I've been working on bifurcation for the last 10 plus years, I would like to pick your brain on the following matter. Obviously, cyber is going to be the fourth and new dimension of warfare. Obviously, it's going to be public, private, and dual use, civilian plus military. It's just inevitable to happen that way. But now let's assume that we are really in this context of bifurcation, which is, by the way, not just China, US. It's China, Russia, the dragon there on the one side as a threat multiplier. So how is ASEAN actually going to cope with such reality? Let's assume for a moment we are in this reality and we have to pick sides. So yes, of course, nobody wants to be caught in a bifurcated world. I agree with that. I've been writing on that for 10 years, but now let's assume we are in this. What is going to be the hedge strategy of ASEAN countries which have leverage, which have location, and yet they have to somehow still oscillate and prevent worst case scenario? And what will be the worst case scenario?
Feel free to take what you want.
Very good questions. I think transparency is important. Transparency as in, I mean, back to your question about attribution. Are we able to be transparent about what is going on? Secondly, whether we can insulate or at least to have security, to ensure security. For instance, maybe not so much of cyber, but the semiconductor sector in ASEAN. There are Chinese investors, but they are mostly American and German, as well as Japanese and Taiwanese establishment. How do you ensure that IPs are not contaminated? I think it's really about having transparency and also having ability to trace and to ensure that there are protection as well as assurance or security, some form of security being put in place. It is not easy, but it is really something that we will have to figure out, and we will have to strengthen each of our capability in order to enforce.
Might jump in on the attribution question because I think it's a great one, and I think it speaks to the wider issue of deterrence when we think about the role of cyber as a tool of conflict potentially. And I think that attribution is one of the important tools in that deterrence toolbox. I think the willingness of governments to come together, we've seen some examples recently of groups of governments getting together, drawing on data from industry as well as their own sources and being willing to publicly attribute attacks and do that collectively. I do think it's one tool in the toolbox, though. I think that, there are examples of targeted sanctions against individuals who've been connected with, major cyber attacks. Hardening digital infrastructure is another deterrence tool. So I think the attribution piece is a really important one, and hopefully it's an area where governments are willing to do more and to work more with industry on that, to take more of a uniform approach. But I think it's only one of the tools in the toolbox. I might just quickly pick up on the question about multilateral institutions as well. And look, I think that there's not one set of institutions that is going to address the challenges or the opportunities we're talking about. But I do think one area where the UN and specialised agencies have been playing an important role and will continue is when we think about making sure that we extend the benefits of AI in particular to as many people in the world as possible. If AI is a general purpose technology, in the same way that electricity is, I think it's clear that one of the lessons we've got to learn from the spread of electricity globally over the last 150 years is that there are still 700 million people who don't have access to electricity. And we've got to avoid that tragedy when we look at the role and the importance that AI will have. So I think that's one very important role that the UN and multilateral agencies will play, is really pushing for that universality of access to that as a key general purpose technology.
Yeah, just to pick up on some of the attribution pieces, and piracy, I think, is a great example. But at the same time, there was an understanding, and I think that, folks still think that nation state actors are sort of performing sort of cyber offensive capabilities in the way that you would think about warfare in a traditional sense. And what we haven't realized is that a lot of this work of sort of cyber, let's say, offensive capability, defensive capabilities, people for hire is a growing part of what we see in terms of cyber threats, right? And so you can still attribute, but that doesn't mean that folks will still see the whole sort of ecosystem that's been built around the fact that, frankly, there are just more mercenaries to hire than ever before. And finding them and tracing them requires a lot more close cooperation, even though that's considered, and as I think it was Steve who said, it was a kind of a dirty word. But I think in some ways when you talk about cooperation, whether it's for the purposes of both creating a enabling business environment or taking harm out of the system or even stopping criminality, there's still common ground to be found. And I think attribution's a really good one, where if there was just some more common norms around how we were doing that and sort of going collectively after what the problem is, which I think sometimes the nation state part is a little over indexed on versus the actual lay of the land right now, which is that they're just a bunch of people for hire that are moving around and they're becoming professionalized. We need other tools, and attribution's a big one, but we need other things to find that middle sort of adversary place where they kind of hide in the shadows. To the question around the folks who are thinking about ITU and standardizations, I think standards have still such a large part of the conversation and standards bodies, but we need to do more to make sure that they're brought to the table in the other ways that ASEAN and others have done, which is to, be partners with the ITU and with WIPO and others. Without them, they're creating very specialized ways in which how to think about these problems systemically. But then individual countries can then think about standards as a need. And without that, then the ITU kind of atrophies, WIPO atrophies, regardless of countries saying, whether they support the UN or they support sort of multilateral bodies that do that, there's still a particular need. And so the work goes on, and the better that work is and evangelize, that doesn't mean that if you don't have just the US or others supporting it, that goes away. The more common, and we've talked about open source, but frankly, the more common that you make something in terms of a standard, or the more common that you make a protocol, it is really hard for you to sort of then, from a market perspective, be standalone. You can try, but eventually that inertia is either going to do one of two things. You're totally going to be isolated, and so your people are not going to be able to get to those great cutting edge technologies, or you're going to end up in a place where you're going to have to come to interoperability ultimately, and that's where ITU and WIPO then come back and help you solve for that problem. So I think, they're in places right now where the ITU and WIPO and others are not necessarily looked at as the first port of call, but I think regardless, they're not going to go away, because so much of the work that they do is the way that we think about interoperability once we kind of get out of, I think, the place we're at right now, which is sort of this economic nationalistic conversation, but people are still going to need to see their systems talk to each other at some point.
We've got 28 seconds. I'm going to ask one more question.
Can I just?
And this is how you guys are going to end it. Is there a specific technology, occurrence, development that is going to change the conversation that we're having tonight on the possibility of a digital Indo-Pacific from tonight's conversation to Raisina next year? What will it be? Quantum, AI, TikTok, a Taiwan contingency? What do you think is going to happen in the next year that's going to change this?
Let me start.
Go ahead.
I think the next 1 year, or probably a little less than that, would be proliferation of the techno-legal mechanism to, I would say, cross-border flow of data for training of large language models.
I don't have an answer. I think the next whole year is about dealing with how to accommodate ourselves into a more volatile situation, but then finding the new equilibrium.
I have no idea. No, but honestly, we've got to be honest with ourselves. Who would have thought in the last 12 months that we would have had the discovery of a new state of matter in quantum research, that we would have had 200 people in a research lab in China change the way many people, whether it's the right way to think about it or not, but change the way many people think about AI and large language model development. I think just the pace of change is so fast. I think the key thing is to have the conversations, to come together, to be resilient, to be responsive, to be inclusive in how we have these dialogues. And then whatever the cool tech is that we're talking about next year, we'll be in a good place to tackle the issues raised.
And I might follow on from that a bit, because I think often the cool tech just enables something that has always happened in human history anyway. So something we haven't talked about so much is misinformation and disinformation. You know, we talked a bit about cyber, but I actually think if you're thinking about a healthy information environment, the way that whatever tools exist now and whatever tools are developed in the future will be used to for disinformation, for undermining social cohesion, for undermining democracy. Those are long-term and difficult issues. And maybe if I can leave, with the idea of digital public infrastructure, potentially including that as a public good as well, having trusted sources, a healthy information environment that people can actually continue to communicate in societies.
Sabine, last word.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that security. Insert whatever new tech you want, but it needs to have security in it as an enabler. So it might be post-quantum encryption, could be AI. It's a must-have.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And thank you for the panelists for their time and insights.